chilly October evening, Jenna and her friends found themselves driving through the countryside on their way to a fall festival in the next town over. The night air was crisp, and the fields they passed were shrouded in mist, giving everything a mysterious, eerie glow. After a wrong turn, they ended up on an old dirt road surrounded by sprawling cornfields. The GPS signal dropped, and despite their best attempts, they seemed to be going in circles. "Look, let's just stop and get our bearings," Jenna suggested, trying to keep the anxiety out of her voice. They pulled over on the side of the road next to the endless rows of tall corn, which seemed to whisper as the wind passed through it. "Hold on, I think I can see a light through there," Jenna pointed out, squinting. There was a faint glow coming from deep within the cornfield. Her friend Mark grinned, suggesting they go check it out to see if someone could help. Jenna hesitated. Something about the light made her feel uneasy, but her friends were already grabbing their flashlights and stepping into the field. Reluctantly, Jenna followed. The corn stalks were towering, much taller than she'd anticipated, blocking out the moonlight and muffling any sound from beyond the field. The only thing she could hear was the crunch of their footsteps on the dry earth and the rustling of the corn in the wind. As they moved deeper, the field seemed to close in around them. The light Jenna had seen was gone, and her friends had started bickering, blaming each other for wandering so far off the road. Jenna looked back to where she thought they had come from, but the corn rows all looked the same, and any sign of the road had vanished. "Let's head back." "This doesn't feel right," Jenna said, but her friends shrugged it off, laughing nervously. Just as they were about to turn around, they heard it, a soft rustling from behind them. Mark swung his flashlight around, illuminating nothing but endless rows of corn. They laughed it off as the wind, but Jenna's stomach twisted. There was something else there, she could feel it. Then they heard it again, a distinct sound, like footsteps. This time, everyone stopped. "Hello?" Mark called out, his voice trembling slightly. Silence. Then, a distant voice answered, low and drawn out. "Help! Me!" Their flashlights flickered, the bulbs dimming, casting eerie shadows over the corn. Jenna's skin prickled. She felt an overwhelming urge to run, but didn't want to leave her friends behind. "Maybe someone really is lost," she whispered, though she didn't believe it. They pressed forward slowly, trying to follow the voice. But every time they thought they were getting closer, the voice moved, sounding just a few rows ahead, always out of reach. Finally, they entered a small clearing where the corn was flattened as though something heavy had dragged through it. In the center of the clearing lay an old, abandoned scarecrow, its straw limbs tangled and torn, its face a cracked, faded burlap sack with hollow, empty eyes. But something about it felt disturbingly alive, as if it were watching them. Jenna's flashlight flickered, and she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Around the scarecrow were several pairs of worn shoes caked with mud, arranged in a circle. They looked as if they'd been hastily kicked off, left behind in a hurry. Mark bent down to examine the shoes, frowning. "These look old, like really old." Suddenly the air grew heavy, and the temperature dropped. The once gentle breeze became a frigid gust, whipping the cornstalks violently. Jenna felt a hand grasp her shoulder, icy cold. She whipped around, but there was no one there. Her friends had started to panic too, feeling the shift in the air. Just then, the voice came again, closer now. It was a chorus of whispers, overlapping, begging, "Help us! Join us!" Mark's flashlight died completely, plunging them into near darkness. In the faint glow from Jenna's flashlight, they saw movement. The scarecrow was no longer slumped but upright, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its hollow eyes seemed to fix on each of them in turn. Then, in one horrific, jerky movement, it raised an arm, pointing a twisted straw hand toward the circle of shoes. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, surrounding them. Jenna could feel a chill seep into her bones, paralyzing her with fear. Without a word, she turned and ran, breaking through the corn as fast as she could, her friends close behind. The whispers followed them, growing fainter but somehow angrier, more urgent. They stumbled out of the cornfield and onto the road, gasping for air, not daring to look back. For a moment, they simply stood there, panting, too shocked to speak. But when Jenna finally glanced back, she saw the faint outline of the scarecrow at the edge of the field, standing alone in the moonlight, its head tilted as if watching them leave. The group scrambled back into their car, locking the doors. As they sped away, they could still hear the whispers, faintly carried on the wind, calling them back, inviting them to return. Later, when they tried to tell others what they'd seen, locals shared a grim story of people who'd gone missing in those cornfields, leaving behind only their shoes. No one knew why or how it happened, but one thing was certain. No one ever entered that field at night and returned the same. On the outskirts of a small town lay miles of cornfields stretching far beyond the eye could see. For as long as anyone could remember, these fields had a reputation, a dark, unsettling one. Locals told stories of strange figures seen among the stalks, of whispers heard in the dead of night, and most chilling of all, of people who had wandered into the corn and never returned. Liam and his girlfriend, Claire, had heard these tales before, but brushed them off as nothing more than small-town myths. They were in town visiting Liam's grandparents for the weekend, and with Halloween only a week away, they decided to take a late-night drive and explore the countryside. The night was cold and clear, and as they passed the cornfields, a thrill of curiosity gripped them. "Let's check it out," Claire suggested with a mischievous grin. "Come on, it'll be fun." Liam hesitated, glancing out at the endless rows of corn. A strange feeling crawled over him, something he couldn't quite shake, but he didn't want to appear frightened. Smiling, he agreed, parking the car along the edge of the road. Armed with flashlights and a sense of adventure, they stepped into the cornfield, laughter bubbling between them. The corn stalks towered high above their heads, creating narrow rows that seemed to close in around them. Their flashlights cut through the dark, illuminating only a few feet ahead, while the rest of the world was swallowed by the dense, silent field. They walked deeper, occasionally joking to mask their growing unease, but something about the night felt wrong. The air seemed heavier, colder, and the silence was so profound it was almost suffocating. "Did you hear that?" Claire suddenly stopped, shining her flashlight to the left. Liam froze, listening. A faint rustling sound echoed through the rows just beyond their sight. "It's probably the wind," Liam said, though his voice wavered. But as the sound grew louder, it began to resemble not the wind, but soft footsteps. The rustling was slow, deliberate, like someone, or something, was moving closer. "Hello," Claire called out, her voice shaky. Only silence answered, but the footsteps didn't stop. They both shined their flashlights into the rows, but the stalks were too dense to see through. Suddenly, the lights dimmed, flickering as though something was draining their batteries. Panic started to claw at Liam as he gripped Claire's hand. "Maybe we should go back." They turned to retrace their steps, but the path they had come down seemed unfamiliar, twisted somehow as if the corn had shifted while they weren't looking. Shadows loomed around them, forming shapes that almost seemed to reach for them as they passed. Every turn they took seemed to lead them deeper into the field, and the footsteps seemed to follow, growing louder, more insistent. Desperation creeping into his voice, Liam tried to calm Claire, who was clutching his arm tightly, her face pale. "Let's keep walking. We'll find the road," he said, though he could barely believe his own words. Then, a voice whispered from the darkness, soft but chillingly clear. "Stay with us." They both froze, hearts pounding. The voice was close, too close. It was neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but something about it felt ancient, as if it had been waiting in the field for years. maybe centuries. The words echoed in the stillness, filling them with a dread unlike anything they had ever felt. Claire's flashlight flickered again and went out completely. In the faint glow from Liam's light, they saw movement ahead. A figure was standing between the stalks, just a few feet away. It was tall, impossibly thin, with elongated arms and a face obscured by shadow. Its eyes glinted faintly, empty and hollow. "Run!" Liam yelled, pulling Claire with him. They bolted through the field, stumbling over uneven ground, clawing their way through the corn. The footsteps followed, faster now, as if the figure was right behind them. The air around them grew colder, filled with the same whispered voices, chanting, "Stay with us. Stay forever." They could see a faint glow ahead, a break in the endless rows of corn. The road, they thought desperately, pushing themselves toward it. But just as they were within a few feet of the edge of the field, Claire screamed. Liam turned, watching in horror as the figure reached out from the shadows, a skeletal hand wrapping around her wrist. "Claire!" he shouted, grabbing her other arm and pulling with all his strength. She was frozen in place, her face a mask of terror, eyes wide as if she were seeing something only she could see. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices, each one desperate and pleading, "Join us and forever." With one last desperate yank, Liam freed Claire, and they stumbled out of the cornfield, collapsing onto the road, gasping for breath. The whispers ceased, and the cold dissipated. They lay there in silence for a moment, not daring to look back. When they finally did, the cornfield looked as it always had, quiet, still, and undisturbed, as if nothing had happened. They climbed back into the car, locking the doors, neither of them speaking as they sped away. For years afterward, Liam would wonder about that night, about what they had seen, and what might have happened if they hadn't escaped. But one thing he knew for sure, he would never go near that cornfield again, and every Halloween he would hear, just faintly on the wind, the soft whisper that haunted his dreams. "Stay with us. Forever." It was a chilly October evening when 7-year-old Daniel vanished. His parents, Laura and Jack, had only taken their eyes off him for a moment. One second, he was running happily through their backyard. The next, he was gone. The only sign of him was his little red jacket, a flash of color darting into the endless rows of corn that bordered their property. Laura's heart sank when she realized where he'd gone. "Jack, he's in the cornfield!" she cried, clutching his arm. Jack wasted no time, grabbing a flashlight and calling Daniel's name as he plunged into the dense rows of corn. Laura followed, her mind racing with fear. The stalks were taller than both of them, casting eerie shadows as the sun dipped below the horizon. They pushed deeper into the field, their voices echoing into the chilling silence. "Daniel! Daniel, can you hear us?" Jack shouted, his voice wavering. The field was silent, save for the dry rustle of corn stalks swaying in the cold evening wind. The corn seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, and it was becoming harder to keep their bearings. The narrow paths twisted and turned, and every row looked the same, as if they were in a maze that had no exit. Jack's hand tightened around the flashlight as he continued to search, feeling a growing sense of dread with every step. Then they heard it. A faint, almost inaudible sound, like someone calling out in a weak, trembling voice. Laura's heart leapt. "That's him! Daniel!" she cried, running toward the sound. The rustling grew louder as they stumbled further in, their breaths heavy, their eyes straining against the encroaching darkness. But as they drew closer, Laura noticed something strange. She could make out small dark spots on the ground beneath the stalks, spots that glistened red in the dim light. Blood. A chill ran down her spine. She clutched Jack's arm, pointing to the dark stains on the ground. "Jack, is that—" Jack knelt down, touching one of the stains with trembling fingers. His face turned pale as he realized what it was. He looked up at Laura, horror reflected in his eyes. They followed the trail, each red spot leading them further into the heart of the cornfield. The whispers around them grew louder, a mix of faint laughter and hushed voices that seemed to echo from the darkness. The field itself felt alive, closing in around them with every step, as if the corn were watching them, listening, waiting. Finally, they saw him. In the middle of the field, Daniel stood with his back to them, his little red jacket torn and covered in dark smears. He was eerily still, his head tilted slightly to one side, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. "Daniel!" Laura cried, rushing forward. But as she reached him, she froze. Daniel turned to face them, his eyes wide and empty, as if he were in a trance. His mouth hung open, and his face was pale, smeared with streaks of dirt and blood. "Mommy," he whispered, his voice soft and strange, almost unrecognizable. His eyes stared past her, distant and unfocused, as though he were looking at something far beyond the field, something they couldn't see. "Daniel, what happened?" Jack asked, his voice thick with fear. He placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, but the boy didn't react. He only looked past them, his lips parting slightly as he muttered, "They were calling me. They wanted me to stay." Laura and Jack exchanged horrified glances. "Who, Daniel? Who wanted you to stay?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. But Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he began to walk away from them, back into the corn. Jack grabbed him, pulling him close, but Daniel's eyes remained distant, his expression unchanged. It was as if something in that field had taken hold of him, something that had left a part of him behind, lost among the stalks. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the field, and the rustling of the corn grew louder. The whispers returned, louder this time, surrounding them, filling the air with chilling, unintelligible words. The corn seemed to close in around them, twisting and bending, forming a wall that blocked their path back home. Desperate, Jack lifted Daniel into his arms, gripping him tightly as they stumbled through the stalks, trying to escape the haunting maze of corn. But every turn seemed to lead them deeper, and the voices grew louder, angry, as if something was furious that they were leaving. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they broke through the edge of the field, stumbling into their backyard, gasping for air. The whispers faded, replaced by the silence of the night. The cornfield loomed behind them, still and silent, as if nothing had happened. Daniel remained quiet, his eyes distant, his face pale. Days passed, but he barely spoke, and when he did, he muttered only one phrase over and over: "They wanted me to stay. They wanted me to stay." Laura and Jack never went near the cornfield again, and neither did anyone in the town after hearing their story. But on cold, windy nights, they could still hear the faint rustling of the corn carrying a single chilling whisper from the heart of the field: "Stay with us, forever."